So I'm here with Dr. Pippin Anderson of the University of Cape Town, the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science. And Pippin, we just finished a really interesting session about socio-ecological theory. And what I found interesting about it, certainly from the work that we're doing, looking at urbanization and the tendency to over-concentrate on big cities instead of thinking about how smaller cities and towns and rural settlements also need good quality urbanization. They have similar demands really that we tend to overlook. And particularly, from our point of view, we're interested in how public space plays a role in urbanization, and especially in smaller towns and in rural settlements. So can you tell us a little bit about your work here at the center? You're also working with the Center for African Center for Cities. Tell us a little more, if you will.
I think what makes the ecology of African cities very interesting is that they obviously differ from the model of the global north, but particularly in that, so rapid urbanization is really what marks them, but we're expecting the greatest growth to be in the small towns. So we're not looking at the sort of Asian model of megacities, we're looking at many more smaller nodes of proliferation. So in addition to that, there's also a tendency for rural urban migration, so the sort of use of a transhumance pattern almost across the landscape, which also is singular to African cities. And then there's, within cities, much greater reliance on nature. So these are the things that define African cities, which make it very exciting to look at ecology in African cities, which is really what I do. I think the combination of these factors, so the very high mobilities across broader landscapes, the kinds of smaller cities that are smaller areas that are turning into dense cities, and then the use of nature in cities, makes for a very interesting opportunity to explore how green space is used in these either rural landscapes or cities. And I think my colleague Leif Peterson, who actually works for the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation, talks very interestingly about what might constitute a cultural or traditional or livelihood practice in a rural landscape can readily be rendered illegal when you cross into a more urban space. So perhaps you're collecting fuel wood, or you're setting snares to catch small mammals to eat or something. And this is very difficult if you've got high mobility. So you've got people entering urban spaces with sort of rural landscape understandings and uses who suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of the law. So you get these very interesting physical, ecological engagements across the landscape, but they come with social, resource use, political manifestations as well. And I think that we need to grapple with that in designing our cities. We need to engage with that rural understanding of how landscapes are used. And I think the kind of traditional global north models of preservationist reserves or very manicured parks, etc., is not something that's going to work in the African landscape. I think we need new understandings and new models of engagement around green spaces in cities.
That's fascinating. Are there big differences between South Africa and other countries in Africa? I would assume there are in the way urbanization is happening and the way the difference between the rural populations and the urban populations that you spoke of.
Absolutely. Of course, we have our sad apartheid history, which very much informs how the geography of our landscapes. It informs the geography in our cities, which remains very racially divided, and informs broader landscape geography with historic patterns of Black South Africans relegated to small parcels of land, very dense settlements, and high patterns of migrant labor, etc. So very transient communities moving through cities, and now people becoming more settled in cities. In terms of South Africa compared to the rest of Africa, we've passed the 50-50 urban-rural split. So whereas the rest of Africa still has more people living in rural landscapes than urban. So that's a significant difference as well. South Africa's got excellent higher education institutions, so there's a huge amount of research coming out of South Africa, which I think swings a bias towards, there's lots of good research coming out of the rest of Africa as well, but the proliferation in South Africa, I think, provides a bias in understanding, perhaps, in how urbanization takes place. And I think we really need to grow more detailed understandings from the rest of Africa.
So when you mentioned the 50-50 number, that caught my attention because one of the research projects we're doing right now is trying to unpack that number and the idea that perhaps some of that is reclassification, some of it is natural population increase, and only some of it is actually migration. And so those are three different conditions that have different factors. And the one thing that I think unites our interest in those is how public space serves as not only a benefit, but a real need, especially for migrants coming into the city, to be able to identify opportunities and perhaps have small businesses and small entrepreneurial activity. Are you doing work in that area as well, or have you worked at looking at the issues of public space for those different populations?
The role of public space in the ecology. So my work primarily focuses on Cape Town. It's where I'm doing most of my work. When I do have other comparative work between Durban and Cape Town and broader understandings of South Africa, but my own particular understanding is quite focused. South Africa, Cape Town sits on is a biodiversity hotspot. It's a recognized biodiversity hotspot with a ridiculous biodiversity conservation agenda. So we have 3,250 indigenous plant species within the city boundary. And that agenda tends to eclipse all engagements around public open space in the city. So when you talk around utilitarian approaches to public space and access, etc., in the particular context of Cape Town, the conservation argument always comes out, and it makes it a very difficult space to have those kinds of discussions that are very necessary around use and access. So there's a huge amount of scope for conversations around public space, and when I'm talking in particular about remnant and conservation, indigenous wildlands in the city of Cape Town, with respect to aesthetics, cultural ecosystem services, recreation, ecosystem services, water purification, etc., carbon sequestration, etc., etc. The kind of utility you're talking about is dealing with recent immigrants, it's dealing with the poor, etc., etc. In the city of Cape Town, I think that that's a space of conflict. Mm-hmm. So that's a point of tension, and that comes up repeatedly in my work. This is something that do we put up fences and watch them get stolen for recycling, or do we try and invite people in? And there have been some really interesting, innovative engagements in the city of Cape Town. There was a program a few years ago called Cape Flats Nature, which trained a group of conservators in the city to really engage with society and communities adjacent to these public spaces and to try and expand the sense of ownership and participation, and it was incredibly successful. And I think those kinds of programs are needed in greater numbers to really try and bring together or try and overcome what has become quite a kind of a point of tension, a caricatured binary around conservation and public access and use. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it really just comes back to the Gini coefficient. We sit with this very steep socioeconomic gradient in all South African cities, but it's particularly evident here, I think.
And that reminds me of some of the work that I know is being done in South America, for example, now, and I think here in Africa as well, to find sustainable ways of life, sustainable sources of income, using the ecology, using the natural systems, and getting people engaged in sustaining ecosystem services, doing various kinds of activities. Is that something that's happening here in Cape Town?
Yes, I think there are definitely. So there's a considerable amount of use of the natural environment, legal and illegal, for livelihood purposes. I think a wonderful example which really brings together the kind of nexus space that urban ecology often grapples with is the city of Cape Town has very high numbers of invasive alien plant species. It's a particular term that might be particular to South Africa. But these invasive species proliferate in the city of Cape Town, and they're a significant threat to our own indigenous biodiversity. And there's a huge informal economy that has sprung up around harvesting those for fuel wood sale. So you've got a wonderful a combination where there's a huge amount of livelihood practice that depends on this invasive alien community. You've got conservation practitioners who are pleased that it's being knocked back and maintained as well. So you get an interesting sort of uncomfortable partnership in that kind of space.
That sounds very promising to me, because it goes to the theme of dealing with externalities, valuing externalities as we talk about when we're talking about sustainable development, and the need to get people engaged in positive activities relating to the ecosystem. The other thing that we're really interested in is how migrants coming into the city might find other ways of life, other forms of income, as a result of their contacts that they make in public space, the sort of social interaction and the new opportunities, life chances in the old expression. And our colleague Setha Lowe has been working on some of those ideas as well. Are you involved in that kind of work? Are you looking at public space as a kind of transitional space for people as they urbanize?
I haven't done any work in that area myself, in the idea of public spaces as being sort of socially catalytic.
Right.
There are definitely cases in Cape Town where there have been public spaces that have become sites of social activism, which may achieve the same end, but for me to frame it like that would be false, I think.
Right.
So I think there are public spaces that definitely serve the sort of survival needs of immigrants to the city, and they're public spaces that are socially catalytic with respect to activism. The kind of thing you're suggesting, I couldn't speak to be quite honest.
So to kind of summarize, one of the most important things that we're concerned about is differentiating between cities, smaller cities, big cities, smaller cities, towns, rural settlements, and their very different needs, and also differentiating between forms of urbanization, in quotes. And can you give us your final thoughts about what we should be mindful of when we're thinking of these differences, particularly in terms of the socio-ecology of these different systems?
So the panel that we've just been sitting in now has really been grappling with this paper by Melissa McHale and partners from 2013, which really tries to put forward the idea that in Africa, very dense rural settlements are in fact urban. So we can look to these rural sites to start understanding some of the kind of informants of what constitutes urban in Africa. So obviously the constant desire is to find theory and to build cases that allow for comparison. So you can say what goes on here goes on there, therefore can be anticipated there, etc. And we can try and manage and roll out systems to attend to broader sustainability, etc., etc. So their premise is that really these very dense rural areas are in fact urban. And what came out in the discussion in our panel is that you get these pockets of rural within cities. So you get these wonderfully complex mosaics. And similarly, you get these very urban kinds of engagements in rural areas. And maybe this rural-urban binary is not that useful. Maybe we need to rethink how we look at our landscapes. And maybe what really is emerging in Africa is that there's something completely different going on. We didn't have these, we don't have these very neatly ring-fenced cities that the global north is more used to. We've got a much more complex, highly mobile landscape, which brings the urban and the rural into play at the same time in the same space in some instances.
Well, that's certainly our interest as well, and thinking about how to unpack different kinds of settlements, different kinds of urbanization processes, in quotes. So thank you very much for your time.